Nuclear power plays a significant role in Nebraska, and my district has the plants, 2 of them, and their life has been extended into some time, and so there is a debate going on as to the proper role that nuclear power is going to play in the future.
Nuclear power, we're finding out today, is pretty safe, it's efficient, it's affordable, it's available. 20 years ago, there were folks in Congress who would love to have shut down the entire nuclear power industry. And it takes about 20 years to build a plant, so we are behind. I mean, you take France, they're well ahead of us in terms of nuclear power, and can't say that I like that.
Nuclear, for example, I mentioned it earlier. That's a technology we know now. It is the safest, the cleanest source of energy we have. And we could be doing that in far bigger ways than we are now using nuclear.
Nuclear Energy. I'm Danny Blaka.
And I'm Brittany Jeffers. The purpose of today's program is to focus on nuclear energy and how it pertains to the bigger picture of energy in the future. We're a group of UNL students who are taking an in-depth look at renewable energy forces in the state of Nebraska, including biofuels, solar, and wind. But today, it's all about nuclear. And this program today is brought to you by an education grant from the Nebraska Center of Energy with funding from Nebraska Public Power District. We're going to start it off today by introducing a few of our experts who will be talking about nuclear energy. And first up, we have Alan Dostal. Alan is a corporate nuclear business manager and nuclear specialist. He has been with the Nebraska Public Power District for 29 years, and 20 of those years he has specialized in the nuclear side of business. Our other expert today is Jerry Hudgens. He's the Electrical Engineering Department Chair at UNL, and he specializes in power electronics. He also focuses on renewable energy systems as well as transportation.
The other half of our discussion today is the students, and so I'm going to have each of the students introduce themselves.
My name is Matthew Calling. I'm from Tecumseh, Nebraska, and a senior fisheries and wildlife major.
Megan Jackson from Bassett, Nebraska, and a natural resource environmental studies senior fisher.
My name is Mitch Payne. I'm from Lincoln, Nebraska, and I'm a sophomore natural resource and environmental economics.
My name's Cassidy Thompson, and I'm a senior environmental studies major from Columbus, Nebraska.
Hi, my name is Tong Nguyen. I'm a pre-dental and biological science major, and I'm a sophomore.
Hello, my name is David Solheim. I'm a senior from Norfolk, Nebraska, studying economics here at the University of Nebraska.
Hi, my name is Dave Dingman. I'm a senior environmental studies major from Lincoln, Nebraska.
The way the format of today's show is going to be the experts are going to start off by giving us a little background about nuclear energy, and then we'll move to a discussion between the students and our experts, and we'll get all of the students' questions answered today. So we'll start off with the experts.
Okay, to get the ball rolling, gentlemen, we're going to start off with Mr. Dostal. If you could just explain to us your stance on nuclear and the information that you have pertaining to it.
I'd like to give a little bit of background why this is such an important topic today. As you know, there's a tremendous amount of discussion about global warming and the topic of CO2 emissions, and is there an impact from the human presence, and particularly the CO2 emissions associated with the human experience on this planet. And what can we do about that? And what are the solutions? And you mentioned some of these earlier, the renewables that we at NPPD are looking at. And a part of the problem is there's a tremendous growth in demand for electrical energy. Everyone has a cell phone. Everyone has a personal computer. There are just so many devices that require electrical energy at all in different times of the day. We're also seeing opportunities for growth in energy demand by fuel switching. Many of our irrigation customers who have used either diesel fuel or propane or natural gas to power their irrigation wells are switching to electric power because it's a cheaper source of energy for them. And we're also seeing a movement in the automotive industry to convert, and we're in the very early stages of this, to plug-in hybrids. So electric power will be used to propel cars for at least a part of the day. So there's tremendous demand. We talk about society being addicted to oil. We're actually addicted to energy, electrical energy. So what are we going to do about it? Well, the nuclear industry has been in this country for quite a number of years. There have been some bumps in the road, and we'll talk about some of the bumps in the road first. Everyone knows about 3 Mile Island. It was a very defining day. In fact, it harkens back to March of 1979, and that's when I started with NPPD. And it was really a big deal because we, NPPD, have a nuclear plant down at Brownville, Nebraska, and there was certainly an impact. It changed the industry. And a lot of good things have been done, and we've been a participant in all of that. Some of the things that people talk about is why nuclear shouldn't move forward is security issues and safety. I think for 3 Mile Island, if you look back at the record, no one was physically injured. There were no fatalities associated with that accident. The safety systems, despite some problems with the operators and their actions, did prevail at the end of the day. The primary containment system did its job, and the radiation was contained properly. So despite some operator errors, which have been addressed through intensive training, and they actually redesigned the control rooms in all the nuclear power plants. That was done at Cooper 2 to make them more user-friendly. They changed what they call the man-machine interface to make it much more logical. So that was a tremendous change. The training for all workers, particularly control room operators, the licensed operators, the standards for training are extraordinarily high. In fact, the licenses are actually controlled by the government. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission issues the licenses, and they're not easy to get. It's a very challenging profession. Another area that people talk about is security. Are these plants safe from terrorist attack? And we believe they are. I like to use an example, and I'll go to pre-9/11 time. There has always been a very robust security system at Cooper Nuclear Station. In fact, I'd like to believe that the security pre-9/11 is as good or better than the airport security that you see today. And we've advanced our level of security very, very significantly since that time. So we take it very, very seriously. We have a lot of involvement from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is our regulator. We work very closely with them to meet all of their standards. And then in practice, we train our guard force very, very well. They're tested in real-life exercises, and we're very happy with the way they've responded to this type of potential threat. So I think that kind of takes that issue off the table. Another thing that people talk about is, of course, the risk from radiation. And I think part of that is just public understanding. Fundamentally, nuclear power has its roots in the atomic weapons of World War II. The very, very same incredibly intelligent people that understood the basics of nuclear power. After the war, they needed something to do. This tremendous infrastructure was built with a tremendous group of colleagues that had unraveled the mystery, a mystery that some didn't think could ever be unraveled. So they were very successful. So what do we do next to solve and find a new use for nuclear power? Well, the same group of people went to work with first the Navy and then even the Air Force, and the Navy ended up developing a very effective, very compact, very safe reactor, and they were very successful in this. The Air Force didn't work out so well. They couldn't get the plane to fly. It just wasn't a good application. So what happened then was that the naval nuclear program really became foundational for the commercial power program in the United States. And it's a very good foundation for it. And the industry developed. And I mentioned 3 Mile Island earlier. People really don't talk about the fact that there are 104 operating nuclear plants. And there, if you look back in almost the 40 years of operation, there have been very, very few incidents. There have been no fatalities associated with the nuclear plant operations. They are industrial facilities, and people do get hurt in industrial facilities just like they would at a coal plant. But directly related to the reactor function at the plant has been very, very safe. In fact, it's probably safer to work at a nuclear plant than many industrial facilities, safer than agricultural type jobs. So the industry has a very good and safe culture. it has a nuclear safety culture and a personnel safety culture, and that involves public safety as well. So I use the word safety a lot. It is absolutely ingrained in everything we do. And those are kind of the negatives. People talk about Chernobyl too, and that was a very unfortunate accident. What the people were thinking that day, I'm not sure anyone will ever understand. They did a very unreasonable test in a reactor in a design that no one in the world would build today. It was basically a it was a time when people in Russia really didn't understand the risks appropriately, and they took risks that they never should have taken. But even then, and there was loss of life, and it was very unfortunate, about 50 people perished from the original accident. And I think people generally think that there's thousands of fatalities, and that really hasn't been the case. Now, there will be some residual effects, but generally those are overstated by reality, and time will really be the final judge of what the final outcome of that is. But Russia has done a better job. They're building 5 new reactors at this time, and they are taking all of the safety design precautions that we would in a domestic nuclear reactor. So they've learned from that accident. It's very, very unfortunate that they did what they did, but they in fact have learned from it. One of the real positives of nuclear power is its reliability, and I think people lose track of that in the reality of situations. Last year, the nuclear power plants in this country ran on a combined capacity factor of 92%. And that basically means of all available hours of operation, and the electric utility business is a 24/7 business. Everybody wants power when they want it, day or night. So that basically means that for 92% of all hours for these plants that they might be available to operate, they did operate. So that takes care of any time out for refueling the reactors, which most plants refuel every 18 or 24 months. So, and those are done in relatively short periods, around the 30-day time frame. So it's a very efficient process. The plants are incredibly reliable. I like analogies. It would be if you could buy a car that if you filled it up and then you drove it at its full speed for 18 months, never taking your foot off the accelerator and then coasting to a stop after 18 months. That's kind of the way nuclear power plants are run. They're run at 100% power, 24/7, and they do that in a very reliable fashion. So they're a wonderful source of energy. And they are always going to be at the foundation of any electric system. Renewable, and they really fit well with renewable energy because wind and solar are considered intermittent sources. So they work well at night and for solar during the day. Wind is a good night resource. But you always have to have the base load of plants supporting keeping the lights on, and then the intermittent resources like wind and solar can kind of fill in, and it makes a good mix. So they're very complementary. So those are really kind of the key aspects. Since the plants have run well and they run fairly effectively, and the pricing is good too. Of your electric bill, a typical bill cost is about 8 to 9 cents a kilowatt. Well, for a nuclear plant, of that final bill, the cost is going to be in the 2 to 4 cent a kilowatt range. So they're just a component. There's also a cost of delivering the power, both through the transmission system and the distribution system. So all of the cost is not production. So nuclear plants are very, very competitive from a cost perspective today. The next generation of plants will be expensive again, but they too, since they are so long-lived, every plant that gets built has a 40-year license, so the plants can be run for 40 years. NPPD is in the process of getting our license extended another 20 years, so we can run the plant 60 years. So you get this really long life of the facility. So if you have to borrow money for it, you have a long opportunity to recover it and pay off your debt. And there's even talk now about extending the licenses another 20 years. So you might get an 80-year life out of a plant, and most plants really don't last that long of other technologies. So it's an investment in the future, and the fact that it is not a greenhouse gas emitting source of energy is really huge. We don't have that many options if coal's not the answer, and there may be some ways to modify the way we use coal to reduce its carbon output. One of the other sources that gets some discussion is natural gas. That too is a finite resource. We have to be very careful how we use our resources. I really believe that at some point, we need to go ahead and move forward with new nuclear technology.
All right, thank you, Ken. We're going to move on to Mr. Hudgens now.
I want to back up a little bit and reframe some of the argument with what Alan has mentioned in terms of electrical energy usage and demand. If you look at what energy it takes just to survive day to day, we'll put a number on it. It's about 2 kilowatt hours per person per day, so just as a number. The typical average usage in the world per day per person now of energy is about 230 kilowatt hours per person per day. So it's over a factor of 100 more. And that not only is expected to increase, as population increases, the total energy demand is going to go up. And so that really raises some serious issues about how to meet that energy demand. As Alan has mentioned, there have been several ways to approach that problem. If you look at the mix of electricity production in the U.S. Is fairly typical of many countries, not in Europe, but we get 50% of our electricity is produced from coal-fired plants, and only about 9% from renewable energy, and most of that's hydro. And so, some of the argument, say, against increased nuclear energy is, in fact, well, we should just put a lot more time and effort and resources into renewable energy. Well, the facts are that because of the issue that have already been expressed about intermittency, there's, some of those renewable sources are just not available 24 hours a day, and this increasing demand, it's not clear that renewable energy can ever have much more than about a 20% load of that total energy demand. The other part of this is the fact that if you look at several of the issues related to nuclear energy, there are several issues that people don't often think about that are associated with this. One of those is we've let training for the nuclear energy business decline, particularly in the U.S., and so just the expertise, the engineering and technician expertise that needs to be there is really not there. And so there's a big push right now to try to grow that new capability. The university is actually involved right now in a program called the Big 12 Nuclear Consortium, because the U.S. Department of Energy has recognized that there's going to be a huge shortage of technical expertise in the next decades. So we're involved in this and trying to retrain and grow nuclear experts. But if we let's go back and look at some of the issues associated. Alan mentioned several of those, but let's talk about probably one of the biggest ones, and that's waste disposal. There's certainly an issue with nuclear waste disposal. One of the problems that the U.S. has is that there was, in the 1970s, the U.S. unilaterally stopped any technology development in nuclear fuel reprocessing. And so, in other words, nuclear fuel is used in a plant, and then those fuel rods are extracted, and instead of reprocessing the fuel, which still contains about 95% of its usable energy, it's stored. Again, the U.S. by legislation mandated that that was going to occur. Well, countries like France, Japan don't do that. They have continued with reprocessing technology so that they can extract that usable fuel and reuse it and make better use of what's available. And so if the U.S. would, in its efforts to expand the nuclear energy business, if they invest in fuel reprocessing technology, that would greatly reduce the volume of nuclear waste material. In fact, it reduces the volume. Experts expect that volume of material will reduce by 95%. So it's a huge savings in just the amount of material that has to be stored. The other issue is the level of radioactivity and how long do you have to store it. There's no physical limit in place that would keep certain technologies, if they were utilized, to reduce the toxicity of the fuel, from like having to store this stuff for tens of thousands of years to now we're talking about hundreds of years. Well, that's still a long time, but the magnitude of the problem is greatly reduced if you're talking about 800 years as compared to 40,000 years. So there are those kind of issues. And so there, you know, like I say, there are no physical barriers to achieving some of those goals. It's just a matter of resources and understanding the engineering aspects of that and what has to be done on large-scale processing. So that's an issue for the industry. There is an issue about proliferation of nuclear material. When these uranium fuel rods are used in a reactor, there's plutonium created. There's certainly concern that that plutonium could be hijacked, disappear, and be refined and used to make nuclear weapons. And again, one way to mitigate that is to reprocess the fuel and use that plutonium mixed with uranium and reuse it to create electricity. So you use up that plutonium, so you don't have this storage of plutonium available. The other, you know, there are issues about costs, unknown costs. Some of that has been mitigated with the way that certification is now done. Back in the 60s and 70s, the permitting process would drag out forever. There would always be court battles over siting, operation, maintenance, so forth, which would extend things, and the cost for actually building reactors was becoming prohibitive, and it really caused a huge problem for the nuclear industry in the U.S. So there's, you know, cost, proliferation, waste, safety. I think, you know, I think Alan addressed that pretty effectively. I do think, you know, you could say that nuclear plants are about as safe as any fixed structure, maybe more so because of the shielding that's required. And you know, there's maybe in a few places a misconception that if you detonate explosives in the right way, you can cause a severe nuclear accident, and what you really do is you spread a lot of stuff around, but there's no chance of a nuclear reaction or anything like that. If anything, it lessens the chance of a nuclear reaction. The last issue that I wanted to raise, and this really goes with large-scale electricity production that people don't necessarily associate with large power plants, and that's water usage. Water is an extremely important resource. We know that, particularly for Nebraska. Water is one of the primary resources that helps the agriculture business in this state. And power plants, whether they're coal, natural gas, nuclear, use an incredible amount of water. So that's an issue that has to be addressed when planning and siting a nuclear plant, and that's certainly an issue for the future. If you think about the western United States in particular, you see a lot of population shift to the southwest. Well, there's continues to be an increasing just day-to-day demand for water, but as more people move to certain locations and a demand for electricity, more power plants, again, more water usage. And so there's sort of a hidden resource limit in there with large-scale electricity production that has to be addressed along with these other issues.
Okay, well, we've heard the stances from the experts. Let's toss it on over to the students.
Let's move on to the dialogue section of our show today, and we're going to start off talking economics, and I think Mitch has the first question.
Thank you. In doing some research for this, I came up with some economic costs and benefits of looking at nuclear power for the future. And this question or these series of questions, I guess it is primarily directed towards Alan. First of all, even if there is reprocessing, even if it goes through the ideal 95%, would you agree that there's still going to be some level of nuclear waste that has to be properly contained, that probably will cost a significant amount of money, that needs to be contained for a long time? Would you agree for that?
That's absolutely true, and there will be a long-term cost. Since reprocessing is being done in other countries, particularly in France and Japan and England, they've mastered this process, and what they've done is they've rendered the material as inert as possible through a glassification process. So it becomes part of a molten mass, so it's incredibly stable, and then they store this material basically in underground in these types of chambers. And the maintenance required becomes very, very minimal because it's in such an inert state. Now, certainly these sites will be monitored for a very long period of time, but the level of monitoring is again fairly static. There's probably some security involved and some technicians involved. These are not great expenses over a long time. So I think those costs are fairly minimal. Just to give you a reference point, everything has an economic aspect to it, and the cost of uranium right now is about $73 a pound. It becomes cost effective to reprocess this fuel when it's at $38 a pound. So there's a tremendous margin, an economic margin to reprocess fuel right now. It's unfortunate that we don't have access to that technology in this country.
Okay, just to follow up with that, I did look at, I was hard-pressed to find information about how much it costs per year to maintain this, and I understand there's, security issues with that. But one study that I did find from the Congressional Budget Office, it was a study done in 1982, financing radioactive waste disposal, and they were looking at repository sites, and for the two repository sites that they were looking at, one was the Yucca Mountain. In $1982, they estimated that the fixed costs of waste disposal management was in $1982 $38 million a year. And granted, I don't know if that's large or small, but that's the number that I found in just fixed costs, not including variable costs. And so in 2005 dollars, that's about $75 million a year. So if we just look at those fixed costs with no interest rate or discount rate or inflation, that comes to over 10,000 years, which is a long time, and the waste needs to be disposed of over that long period of time. That comes to $750 trillion that we're going to impose, and I'm assuming that that's a very conservative estimate for just one repository site, not to mention those in France and Japan and all over the rest of the world. So in looking long term, and I'm an environmental economics major, I tend to look long term, it seems like this is, very cost prohibitive, and there's no benefits from nuclear waste whatsoever. How do you respond to those figures?
Well, since you actually caught my attention at 38 million, the trillions were were way over the top. Well, those are really good societal questions. Economics is a part of every decision we make. And I'd like to give you a little background on what we have done today. We have actually an agreement, contract with the Department of Energy for them to take our used fuel. We've had this contract in place for many, many years. Under contract, they were supposed to begin receiving our fuel on January 31st, 1998. They've been in default of that contract since that time. We pay the Department of Energy 1 mil for every kilowatt hour we produce of energy from Cooper. It amounts to about $6 million a year. In total, we've transferred from Nebraska to the Department of Energy to the Treasury about $140 million since we've been working on this. We're quite frustrated, in fact, so frustrated that we filed litigation against the DOE to try to get them to solve this problem. I think since this is it's a big issue, it's a societal issue, it is appropriate for the government to be involved to share some of these costs. And I think it's the most cost effective to store all the fuel in one place. If we have fuel stored at all of the 104 reactors in the country, that will be very, very inefficient. I do believe that once the repository is up and running, if we don't basically recycle the fuel, and I believe that will happen. I think even if we would put that facility into operation, it might sit there for 10 or 20 years, but I believe at some point society and technology will recognize there's tremendous value, tremendous amount of energy in that used fuel that can be reused. So if we do store fuel there, I don't think we will store all of it for 10,000 years. It might be a very, very small part of it, and that would reduce the cost. But there is certainly a lot of uncertainty about what the long-term costs are with really any energy source, and I think that's true about coal as well.
If I can interject, one way to put sort of an economic measure on uranium fuel. If you look at the energy content of uranium fuel, 1 kilogram of uranium fuel has the same energy content as 17,000 kilograms of coal. So there's economics in mass there.
Great. I think our next question is coming from Matt.
All right. My question is focusing on alternative energy instead of using nuclear energy because although it can only be 20% at max due to its intermittency, I would argue that that's still, I mean, that equals what nuclear is putting out right now. And in Nebraska, our 2 stations I found are putting out around 9.5 megawatts a year. Is that right?
Actually, on a megawatt hour basis, Cooper produced about 6.5 million megawatt hours last year. We had a really good year. I would say that Fort Calhoun Station probably produced between 3 and 4 million megawatt hours. So in total, they would be about 9 million megawatt hours.
See, and I found the largest wind turbines, the largest one actually, is rated at 6 million or 6 megawatts? 6 million megawatts?
Yeah. Right.
And so, I mean, why should we build nuclear power plants, which when we can build wind turbines with roughly the same equivalency in power?
Go ahead and talk about capacity.
Well, yeah, and part of the story is capacity. NPPD's wind farm up with Ainsworth, which is really a good wind facility, and we're really proud we have it, and we've shared it with OPPD and LES and Mean, and there are some other players. I think Grand Island has a share in this, so it's a collaborative project. It is rated at 36 megawatts, no, 60 megawatts, I'm sorry, 60 megawatts. Cooper is rated at about 790 megawatts. So there's a big difference in size. If you were to derive the same amount of energy out of a wind facility in Nebraska using about that 40% capacity factor, to equal Cooper's output, you'd have to have about 1,000 wind turbines to match the amount of electrical energy. So it takes a lot of wind turbines to generate that much electricity. And then we'll go back to my other point. You would not have, you'd have too much power some of the time, and you might not have any at another time, where Cooper is always running at that high level of output. So it takes a lot of wind machines to match the output because of the difference in capacity factor. Wind is only available about, and again, the Ainsworth site is a wonderful site at about the 40 or 42% capacity factor, probably one of the best in the nation. But the nuclear plants where they run, Cooper actually ran at 100% capacity factor the way it's rated. So it really ran all the time, and that just doesn't happen with wind.
I was going to mention one of the really key issues when you start talking about how much nuclear energy, renewable energy should be in the mix is really kind of a systems decision. You know, what's the overall best answer to address the entire problem. And you know, one of the issues related to that is that there is no good way to store electrical energy. And so that has a huge, huge problem. And so when you're talking about sources that are intermittent like solar and wind and some other things, wave energy and so forth, when you don't have that consistent power production, you know, you want to store it in some way and use it when you need it, and you know, when you don't need it in the middle of the night when there are no lights on, have that energy capability for generation and store that. But there's just no good way to do that. There's no economical, efficient way to do that on any large scale. I mean, batteries, you know, we're so used to batteries, but batteries are really horribly inefficient compared to large power production systems. And so to try to, you know, if you wanted to scale something up to that amount of energy is just not, if not physically impossible, it's certainly economically not possible at this point. And so that's a key research issue for folks in the energy business.
So real quick to follow up on the wind topic, so would it be better economically to focus on individual basis and give them a discount for erecting their own wind farm or a hybrid system, and then to install, let's say, a bigger turbine that produces more, so you wouldn't have to worry so much, and they could be connected to the grid with this hybrid system. So, and I also saw in EPD you're working in the net metering, which I was actually pretty happy to hear. And so anyway, with this system, it would be a hybrid system, so they could, on an individual basis, everyone could produce their own energy and then take from the source, and that would be a good way to promote alternative energy and still have that reliability factor. Do you think that would be a better way to go about it, to focus on the individual basis than big wind turbines?
Well, certainly there's potential for individuals to have their own wind turbines, and we support that. We support through the legislature and through our own policies approved by our board of directors. So all of these things are falling into place. What's unique about that is that there's also a safety consideration when additional people put energy into the grid. Energy, when it's basically contained in the system, into the outlets, it's all very, very safe. But when we take lines out of service, we have to be 100% assured that the lines are not energized. And if there are 50 or 100 or 1,000 individuals with individual either wind turbines or solar facilities feeding power into that grid, we have to somehow be assured that they are disconnected. So it adds a real complexity to the operations of the system because safety is such an important part of our business. And electricity can be very dangerous if not properly controlled. So that's an aspect to it that as this develops, and I expect that we'll see a development of more individuals that have invested in their own wind turbines and other sources like solar, we'll have to be always cognizant of that and have an ability to deal with that.
I was going to mention there's just in engineering terms, there is economy of scale, so bigger is better. You just, and even economically, it costs a lot of money to put in one of these large towers, move the turbine blades around and so forth. And so if you're going to do it for one, it's cheaper to do it for 100 than one-off kind of things. The other issue is that even if you increase the renewable energy, which we should do certainly, there's still a question about are you going to be able to hit that 20% mark because of the continuing increase in demand for electricity. It's just you're trying to play catch up all the time, and so we have the technology. It's just a question of can we get it installed quickly enough to even hit that 20% mark. There's some studies that say if we go as fast as we can with installation of wind energy systems, we're still going to fall behind in the demand. So the net effect is, if you look at the total percentage of energy production from renewable sources, it's actually going to decrease in the future. So.
Thank you. Our next question will be from David.
Thank you. Nebraska is in the somewhat unique position in that power production in the state is a public enterprise. My question to you would be, what criteria should a power source meet here in the state to be considered a viable power source? Is it only about low cost, or is there an element of rural economic development to it as well, or anything else?
There's certainly one of the great benefits of having a public power system in the state has been that energy has been very cheap for a very long time. In fact, Nebraska is sort of the envy of many states around the country. On the downside of that, there maybe has been in the past a tendency to say, well, our only mission is to produce the cheapest power we can produce for the citizens of the state, and that has maybe limited thoughts about looking at alternative energy production. I think to NPPD's credit, in recent years, I think that has certainly shifted, and they are really been very supportive of development of renewable energy systems in the state and the public policy and legislation that is required to make that a reality. If you look at your sort of second part of your question is related to rural economic development, there's certainly an aspect of that with renewable energy, particularly with wind farms. There's potential increase the tax base, land lease payments, not to mention just selling the actual power that's produced from the wind farms. So there is potential there, and then of course there are jobs to be created. I think the estimate by the DOE National Renewable Energy Lab is that if the country achieves this 20% infusion of wind energy into the electric grid by 2030, that's equivalent to, if you look at the lifetime, about a 30-year lifetime of those wind turbines, is equivalent to about 3 million jobs. So there's certainly an economic benefit.
And certainly NPPD is supportive of all of that. Part of our economic development in Columbus, Nebraska, there is a new wind turbine tower manufacturer. They're building their facilities right now. So we certainly see wind in the future for Nebraska. Before too long, you'll hear about another wind project that NPPD is going to deploy with the seabed type project. So more renewables are coming to Nebraska. I'd just add that one of the challenges for wind, and Nebraska is a great site for wind, but where the wind is best is the least or most sparsely populated regions of Nebraska, and there's really not that much transmission there. So one guy at NPPD likes to say, well, if you like wind, you have to love transmission, because you have to be able to get the power out from the wind sites into the population centers and to where our customers are.
Great. Our next question comes from Megan.
Thank you. So I actually tend to look more at the social aspect of things, and one of the things that I'm concerned with is still as long as we've invested in nuclear energy, we still do not have a national permanent waste disposal site because of the concerns with that waste, and you guys have really addressed that very well. However, we've seen waste disposal sites where they have been become an issue of environmental justice. These typically are focused in areas where more rural areas, where there's a lower social economic class, or areas of minorities. A good example is in Butte County, where there's been a lot of controversy too about that site. Do you see that possibly Nebraska's investment in nuclear energy and this increase, maybe even if that happens nationwide, that Nebraska itself might be centered as an area of possibly a good site a waste disposal site, seeing as how we have kind of open grassland areas and the sandhills, these rural areas, but also not having an earthquake, these zones either. Do you see that as a potential problem?
Well, you raised really an interesting point, and it's all about perspective on things. So I'm going to divert a little bit back to wind. Wind, I think, is seen as a great economic opportunity for Nebraska, and I think there's people on the coast say, well, there's lots of open space out there. Let's build lots of wind turbines there. Well, if you go to the East Coast, in one particular area, there's been a developer trying to build offshore, and I forget exactly how far offshore, but the residents there, and they say they don't want CO2, they want green energy. They have spent millions of dollars in court trying to stop, in fact, have effectively stopped the development of this wind farm, and it would be a very good site because they don't want to look at it. They're using their economic power to stop this development. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, and it all comes down to it's the old NIMBY, not in my backyard. What is acceptable to any segment of society? So in some ways, those individuals are dumping wind turbines in our backyard because it's socially acceptable here, but it's not socially acceptable there. It's kind of the flip of low-level rad waste disposal, not in my backyard. But some people do find it acceptable. So it's trying to find that balance, and it's really, really hard. I think as a nation, we have to somehow come together and find the political courage to solve these types of problems. And frankly, right now, I don't see anyone in the forefront, anyone running for president who's willing to even get close to those discussions. So I'm very frustrated with that.
Can I jump in on, I'll be pretty blunt about putting a nuclear waste disposal site, a long-term site in Nebraska. I think it's a really dumb idea. That, if nothing else, because of the potential for food production in the state and the fact that there's this wonderful resource, the Ogallala Aquifer, I think that clearly there are better locations around the U.S. And so, again, as Alan mentioned, it comes down to what's the political will to do the right thing, and somebody's going to be unhappy, but somebody's going to be unhappy. So sometimes people have to be unhappy for the good of everybody else. And so there is certainly going to be a role for the federal government to play in this, because they're going to have to sort of, as they're trying to do now, mitigate between states.
Mr. Dossel touched on the fact that they don't want, not in my backyard. In your opinion, and any of you's opinion, would you prefer to have a coal power plant in your town or a nuclear power plant? I mean, do you have an opinion on that? I mean, would one make a difference?
we have wind. You know, and that it's difficult, and we've seen too that that there are communities with nuclear power plants that that don't necessarily disagree with, you know, with that production and with that plant being there. However, you know, and again, I'm going to go and say, if with the disposal, you know, do we want a waste disposal in Nebraska anywhere? No. You know, and for those reasons, because of our tremendous resources. But I just think that is a significant concern that that we should have, that Nebraska being a potential for those areas. So,
real quick, growing up in Tecumseh, it's not far from Brownville, so I've lived all my life by a nuclear station, and so I probably, even though I do not like nuclear power, I'd rather have a nuclear power plant, because, I mean, all the years I've ever lived there, and I know people that work there, and it's just, they're nice people, and it's good energy. It's just, I just don't like the side effects.
Thank you. Our next question will be from Dave.
All right, thanks. I'd like to bring the discussion back a little bit more to the specifics of safety with nuclear energy. And I was wondering if you could go into a little bit more of the specific safety measures currently in place at our nuclear energy facilities, and then as we look to expand those facilities or create the next generation facilities, what kind of changes or additions to those?
It's a feasible option in our country like they have it in France.
I think that's really a good point, and I think the monitored is a good part of it, and there's an economic aspect to that, but the retrievable part is important too. I think if we ever do develop Yucca Mountain, it should be a retrievable storage facility, because there is so much value in the energy that's left. So I hope when it's put in operation, that aspect of it is kept so we can retrieve the fuel for future use.
I was going to say that, to me, the right policy for new nuclear plants and certification of new nuclear plants is with the intent and the idea that as reprocessing of the fuel, as that technology is developed, that will go forward, and those new reactors are capable of using that reprocessed fuel, because I think that's plan to increase the nuclear energy production without also including fuel reprocessing is not a good solution, because if we do the reprocessing again, you so greatly reduce the volume of material that you even have to worry about. So I really think that kind of public policy and legislation has to go hand in hand.
Great. And our final question of today's program will be asked by Dong.
Okay, so according to the Energy Revolution Blueprint, it shows that if we make the right choices, we have the resources and tools needed to safeguard a sound environment, political stability, and thriving economies with our nation's nuclear program. Well, my question is concerning where is the U.S. with our nuclear program, and what is likely to happen with it in the future in regards to our safety and the program.
Well, the Energy Policy Act of 2005 put in place, and the federal government put in place, a number of aids to help the restart of the nuclear program, sometimes called the nuclear renaissance. And they're basically risk mitigation factors from a financial standpoint.
We would like to thank everyone today for participating, both the experts and the students, in participating in our nuclear energy discussion. And again, it was made possible with an education grant from the Nebraska Center of Energy Sciences and Research with funding from the Nebraska Public Power District.
We want to thank Bill Luxford, Tarek Ablumenum, as well as the students behind the scenes, including Derek Sassman, Robert Ford, J.C. Benson, John Bondegart, and Josh Anstein. Our professors, Amy Struthers and Jerry Renault, as well as, of course, the students and the experts here today. So from all of us at the College of Journalism and Mass Communications at UNL, thanks for watching and have a great day.